Hi, I'm Dr. Ellen, the Midlife Whisperer, and I hear you and I've got you. Think of me as the one-stop shop for all your midlife needs. I'm a psychologist, registered dietitian, nutritionist, board-certified health and wellness coach, and mindful self-compassion teacher. I'm also an author and podcast host with over 30 years of experience empowering midlife women. Hey, everybody, Dr. Ellen here, the Midlife Whisperer. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have a great show for you about a rather serious topic that I'm actually super excited about because I haven't talked about this, I don't think, on my podcast before. We're really going to talk a little bit about trauma. And I know what you might be thinking. You hear trauma and it's like, no, Dr. Ellen, that's not me. Trauma is for people like, war veterans, people who have, been mugged, been raped, gone through some kind of child abuse. But I'm here to say that most, if not every single one of us has experienced trauma, and we have this label trauma, but the reality of it is that yes, all of those things I just mentioned are really awful, but the key with the trauma thing is we go into overwhelm, and all of us have experienced that in our lives. I know that I have. And one of the key things to do if you want to rock your midlife is to heal your trauma. And today's guest is really going to help you. She is Madeleine Eames. She's a psychotherapist, a pain educator, a yoga and breathwork teacher, and she's really going to help us to rebirth ourselves at midlife through transformational breath work. And I know, myself, I've had a lot of therapy. I've done a lot of healing in my life. And I have to say, if you had seen me 10 years ago, you would not recognize me. I had clinical depression. I experienced a ton of trauma. When I was a little girl, 3, 4, 5 years old, my parents fought all the time. They still fight. They are together. They are in their 90s. I guess they've been married, 70-ish years at this point. They adore each other. They love each other. That's how they communicate. But when I was 3, 4, 5 years old, I didn't understand that. And I would see them and I would literally go into the closet and I would hide. And that was trauma. Seeing my parents fight overwhelmed me. And so, fast forward 30 years, I'm an adult. I'm in a relationship. I was married for 25 years and my ex-husband and I fought all the time. And instead of dealing with it in a mature fashion, I literally went into the closet. I was like, I can't deal with this. This is too much. I'm overwhelmed. So that's just an example that, yes, we think about these terrible things like, PTSD and rape and, child abuse as trauma. But pretty much most of us have been in these periods in our life where we have gone into overwhelm. Just think about circumstances like job loss, death of someone close, betrayal in a close relationship, not knowing how to pay for your basic needs, a car accident, working under stress in a demanding job. What happens is when we don't process and heal our trauma, when we experience things that trigger that, whether that is, a close relationship, I still am working on some things. There's people in my life who trigger these things in me and I'm becoming more aware. What happens is we go into the stress response. And when we go into the stress response, our body starts to generate cortisol, which is the hormone of fight and flight. And what that does is it increases inflammation. And of course, inflammation is at the root of pretty much all of the chronic diseases from, heart disease, cancer, chronic fatigue, all of these things. And so if you're experiencing those things at midlife, it's really time to take a lens and do some healing. And I'm here to say that, yes, healing work is challenging, but today's show is really going to give you the keys to start to do that work. And the beautiful thing is when you heal your trauma and you really go into these difficult, dark spaces, preferably with a trained professional who knows how to do this work. I know I was working with a psychotherapist who's very trained in what's called EDMR, which is a certain technique where you bring up these traumatic experiences and you sort of reintegrate them as an adult so that you can function and they don't trigger you constantly. The beautiful thing is that when you go to these dark places, you experience more light. When you go and you go into these places where you were angry, where you were frightened, where you were frustrated, where you're overwhelmed, and you start to process the difficult emotions, you experience more joy, you experience more love, you experience more of the truth of who you are, and you're really able to move forward in your life in a beautiful way. So I encourage you to maybe grab a piece of paper and a pencil, because you're going to learn a lot from my guest, maybe a box of Kleenex. But before we kind of dive into the work, I want to let you know that trauma is, you're able to heal your trauma and integrate it into your life. Yes, it takes work. And you have to relearn your survival tactics, relearn what's no longer needed. But it really is such an important part of the process of rocking your midlife. So let me introduce you to our guest. Again, she is Madeleine Eames. She is a psychotherapist, a pain educator, a yoga and breathwork teacher. She has been working in the area of mental health and healing trauma for over 3 decades. Her focus lies now on helping women heal old conditioning and patterns so they can embrace real freedom at midlife. Welcome to Rock Your Midlife. So good to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ellen. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, I'm so glad you approached me, because I haven't talked about trauma. And I know that I'm not a licensed psychotherapist. I'm a coach, and I do work on these things. It's kind of from an energetic vibration. So I'm really excited to dive into it with someone who is a clinician, who knows how to work with this on another level. So I guess to start, how do you define trauma?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because I think we do steer away from the topic of trauma. Because we are so conditioned in exactly how you just introduced it. We think of trauma as more veterans or having like one of those big T traumas, when, what you described just now for a little girl is traumatic. And it's those little T traumas, like the little T traumas that I see more often than the obvious ones, shall we say. So in what you just described right now, there's those moments in our life where we didn't feel safe for whatever reason. We didn't feel safe to be ourselves in our body because we were overwhelmed, and we didn't have a chance, or we didn't have support, or we didn't have the context to be able to feel it and express it. So those little moments, it's those moments of overwhelm where what was coming at you was too much for your little nervous system or your bigger nervous system. And in today's world, so that's how I would describe it, those moments of overwhelm that are too stimulating for your own nervous system in the moment. So
yeah, you shut down. It could be something so simple as like you're 6 years old and you lose your best stuffed animal, and your mother is like, come on, we're late for the appointment. And you're like, I just lost, Buffy. And you're just like overwhelmed. And you just decide, I'm never going to love anything again, because if I love something, I can lose it.
Exactly. And if you dove into that moment, there's sadness, there's maybe anger at someone else for having, put it in another place where it got lost, or anger at yourself. And it's not like you have to go back. I want your listeners to hear that you don't have to go back and go through everything that's happened to you, because in today's world, things are happening all the time that leave us in overwhelm. And we don't have that society, particularly for women, that and men, absolutely, when it comes to certain emotions, that it's not always safe to be able to express or describe or even talk about how you're feeling inside your body. So what you described, going into fight or flight, but even more often going into the freeze, the shutdown, the numbing out, the not being able to feel what's happening in my body, because I mean, that's why these conversations are so important, because willingly, we don't often go into those dark places, you know, until maybe life sometimes, unfortunately, presents us a situation where we have to.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about your journey and how you decided to focus on the midlife transition.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, I would say most recently, about 4 years ago, you know, just talking about when life gives you those circumstances that, you know, you actually have to face yourself. You actually have to feel now what's in your body. So about 4 years ago, we made a move to a new town, and I was working. You know, I didn't know a lot of people. I was just busy getting, you know, I'd been busy for a long time. I'd been busy for decades. I had closed a practice that was always had a wait list. That you know, I was doing trauma work day in, day out, bringing up kids. I was busy with my family, and all of a sudden, it was like I was dropped into a new place. Got my older son settled in school, and very shortly after that, COVID hit. And so all of my social connections, all my work that was, and I hadn't even, you know, set up another practice, went online. And so I was working, teaching, doing some counseling online. But what I found in that gap, in that period of time, that I found that I was really tired, because there was no kind of escaping myself anymore. There was no kind of distracting myself. And I realized that I was very tired. I was fatigued and I was burnt out. And I would have found that out eventually, I would hope, but it surprised me, because I work with women all the time around self-care, taking time out, looking after your, you know, your body. And here I was burned out. And so I, you know, for a while there, I was trying to get busy again, and it just wasn't working. It was COVID. And at a certain point, I had to, I suppose. I also chose to just let go. And what happened there, and this, what I really want women to hear, is that letting go can feel, that surrendering can feel like giving up. You know, so the inner critic, the loud voice in my head was coming up going, well, what are you going to do? Like, what are you doing? How are you going to make money? Like, what's going to happen to you? I was in my early 50s, and that was the chatter. When we start, as you said, letting go of those ways of coping with what might be happening in your body. So I slowed down, and I made a conscious intention to, you know, to move through some of the layers of anxiety that were coming up. And as I did, it didn't get better overnight, I'll tell you that much. It took a while. And eventually I was kind of going to my office, you know, teaching a class for the pain clinic I was working, because all the programs were online, and I would go and rest in between. And I would do something and I would rest in between. And so you can imagine the inner voice that I had to contend with when I just got supper on the table, and that was enough for a day.
Yeah, I love that you're sharing the story and the vulnerability, because there's so many elements of that, which I think, even though you're a therapist and you sort of are supposed to kind of know better and see these things, we don't always see ourselves. But first, the busyness, right? So often when we're experiencing difficulties in our lives, it's a lot of, especially if you're kind of a workaholic, or you're like, okay, I'll just stay busy. I mean, we are addicted to busyness, because when we're busy, we don't have to face the difficulties that we're experiencing. You know, I'm just staying on that treadmill, but getting to this place where it's just, it was too much. And then just having the courage to let go. And I see this a lot with my clients, women who have sort of, you know, been in these corporate jobs their whole lives, and their whole identity, like what you're saying, my identity, my livelihood is all connected with this job. And this job is actually starting to make me sick. An overwhelm is saying, you know, it's time to take a look at this, but and as we start to let go, these layers of anxiety that are there because our self-definition is so wrapped up in who we are with this career. And then there's all of this fear associated. I see this with women too. It's like, well, if I'm not this, then who am I? If I'm not my job, then who am I? And if I'm not getting the steady paycheck, how am I going to live? And often if we can sort of just step away a little bit and calm our nervous system down, we can start to get solution focused and see, like I was working with a client the other day, and she's in a 3-bedroom house in California that she's having trouble, like it's expensive. And I was like, well, why didn't you get a roommate or two? And she's like, well, I'm really actually kind of lonely because my daughter left. And so I could, we can look and find solutions. So what was the point that you were, able to just quit? Did you just sort of drop it all and give yourself like a sabbatical, or what was the transition period like for you?
That's a great question, because the whole idea of busyness as a badge of honor and our identity, I think really comes in. I had a really fast track into midlife here that may have taken me a bit longer, but I realized that these are the things that come up for women often at midlife anyway, at a certain point. So I still, dragged myself in front of the camera and taught my classes. And I actually really enjoyed that. I realized I enjoyed that hour of teaching. And then I would really let go and rest and eat well. And one thing I would do, because I have a dog, is that I would walk morning and night. And it became like it was like a staple. It was something I had to do. I really emphasize that, having just some kind of regular habit or routine that you can count on during those periods of transition. Anything. Maybe it's your morning routine, maybe it's your breath work or meditation, or maybe it's walking. And so I continued that way for quite a while. And then I realized, there were 2 more layers because it's a never ending journey. There were 2 more layers that came after that I am sure if I stayed busy, I would have never discovered this, because there was no amount of mindset work that could get me out of nervous system depletion. I tell myself good things, and it's like, oh, I'm so tired. So the next thing that happened was that I discovered, in conversation with family, that I had processed things very differently in my nervous system than the rest of my siblings had. And I came into this in my 50s to realize that I was one of those categories of 20% of people who are highly sensitive people, an empath. And I'd heard the word, I'd heard the things, but again, I had never identified myself there. And I realized that, deeply feeling, intuitive women often are very sensitive to their environment, very intuitive, and, really absorb and take on other people's emotions, feelings, take responsibility for other people, because we're like super caring people. We often end up being coaches or therapists or healers of some sort. So that opened up a whole other level for me, realizing that not everybody absorbed things like I did. And the women that I was working with, again, in chronic pain and trauma, they all, when I would kind of inquire a little bit, would identify with this, and not being able to, hold the boundaries very well, because they felt things so deeply. And so that was a real eye opener. And then I started developing courses around, how to cope as a highly sensitive woman in this world. That took me one step deeper, even, Dr. Ellen, because this part really was an eye opener when I realized that what I was dealing with in my own life, there were 3 patterns that were coming up consistently in the women that I was working with. And I realized that this was a cultural, it sounds so simple now, but it was a cultural conditioning that existed long before we got here for women. And when I introduced this idea to women, it relieved a lot of the guilt and the shame of, there's something wrong with me. I'm not enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not whatever enough, you name it. And, we've felt it.
Yeah, we
And
are
so this,
conditioned that first, like what I'm hearing is we're conditioned to put everyone and everything else first, and thinking about like, we're feeling other people's stuff and we want to heal them and have them feel better, but it's actually draining us. And then this other piece that you're saying of just this not enoughness. And I find that the not enoughness is really the biggest barrier to attracting what we truly want in our lives, because then what happens if we don't feel worthy, if we don't feel like enough, then every time we get close to what we want, we sabotage ourselves because we're like, oh, I don't deserve this. I'm not worthy. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not worthy enough. I'm not pretty enough. All of these things of not enough. And so the universe is giving us what it is that we believe, which is you don't deserve this, so you're not going to get it.
Exactly. So all those things that women, I don't have enough money, or I don't have the love relationship that I really want in my life. I don't have the health that I want. And when those things would arrive in their lives, there wasn't the celebration, the welcoming, the receiving of it, because the next step was, well, when's this going to go? Because I'm not worthy of holding it in my life, meaning in my body. And so there were these three patterns that I saw consistently, and they were people pleasing. So over-giving to other people and absolutely being drained. And if I'm not giving, I'm not needed and I don't feel good enough. Perfectionism that, always leads to, I should be doing something else. I should be someone else. And personalizing. So taking everything personally for fear of rejection. That was also a big one, that core wound of like, if I get criticized, I'm not going to put myself out there. What if someone leaves a comment, a negative comment, or, criticize me? And so women not really reaching their potential because of this fear that was in the way.
Yeah, I just want to repeat those, because I'm sure if you're listening, because I know that I checked all the boxes for all three of these. So the first one is people pleasing, right? So you are turning yourself into a pretzel to please other people instead of pleasing yourself and doing what is in your best interest. You're trying to please everybody else. And then when they're not appreciative, then you're even like, then you get resentful because it's like, I am doing everything I can to please you. So people pleasing is number one. The perfectionism, which is just awful. And that's actually something that I see in this generation all the time, where we are needing to be perfect. And that's why I love self-compassion so much, because the second element of self-compassion is this common humanity. We are imperfect beings. If you're listening, nobody is perfect. We all make mistakes. That is how we learn. That is how we grow. But if you've got this perfectionism thing, either you can get really stuck in procrastination because it's like, well, I can't do it perfect, or you're just not even going to start because everything has to be all lined up and perfect before you even put yourself out there. So it's definitely keeps you super stuck. And then this is one that was new for me, and people pleasing perfectionism I'm super familiar with, but this personalizing, this idea of, everything's about me and this fear of rejection. So I love that you have coined those three. So I'm really curious if you can share a little bit, what is this connection with the women you work with between the trauma and the chronic pain? Because I do meet a lot of women, work with a lot of women who have, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. I also see a lot of people with long COVID, a lot of people who are experiencing a tremendous amount of chronic pain. Again, going back, my lens, it's kind of both as a nutritionist, like, okay, how's your diet? How's your inflammatory response with the stress? But what are you seeing in terms of the connection between trauma and chronic pain and that healing connection that women need?
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw this in so many, if not all, of my women in general, but particularly, the women who have chronic pain. And it led me to dive even deeper. And I have a whole, resource library of webinars on various topics of interviewing other experts, because I was really curious, like about nutrition, about movement, about, emotional regulation. And so I would say the biggest burgeoning area of treatment of chronic pain right now is diving into those underlying emotions underneath. And often what I'm finding is the freeze response at certain points in our life, because of that cultural conditioning. So going back to, a lot of high achieving women, just like myself coming into my 50s, and all of a sudden I'm fatigued. I started to have a lot of muscle aches, and I know fibromyalgia. I work with it all the time. And I was like, this is actually, this could be happening to me. And what we know now is that often either as a result of pain, this is not always, I would just want to make it clear, it's not always the cause of chronic pain. Sometimes it started by an injury, by an illness, but it can also be caused by emotional stress. And we know that emotional stress absolutely fuels a dysregulated or shut down nervous system that feeds central sensitization, which leads to chronic pain. And this was like a light bulb for me and for a lot of the people that I teach, that, there's something that your nervous system is doing. It's not always that you have more damage in your body. Maybe you have arthritis, which, we know that inflammation again can really fuel chronic pain conditions. But I call it stuck emotional energy that sits in our body that keeps us not breathing very well, short and shallow breaths, keeps us in that fight or flight. So we're really operating from like the chest up. This is not just people with chronic pain, but it keeps us in a dysregulated system that, and I think this is key, is always looking outside of ourselves for an answer. I'll try, and there's nothing wrong with that search. I think we need to go through it. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. I should do this. And when all those things are not really working, we need to do something different. And so I see those patterns. I'll maybe just weave this in here a little bit as to what kind of came next was, I see these patterns as a particular, and I'll use the word archetype, like a type that we can identify with when we see it coming up, like the 3 Ps, which is also looking outside of ourselves for approval, for validation, for our worthiness, and also not being able to really, set very good boundaries. So really, not being able to look after ourselves emotionally so well. And
I want to say too, that none of this is your fault. It sounds like you. It's important that you give yourself a break, because what happens is when we're kids, our parents tell us to like, be quiet, finish your food, keep your room clean, get good grades. Our parents are caregivers. And if we don't do those things, we are in danger of not being loved, not being cared for, being abandoned. So we internalize this inner critic. And so when we get to be adults, we have this voice of the inner critic that says, you got to please other people or you're not going to be loved. You've got to like be perfect or you're going to be criticized. You've got to take everything personally. Your life depends on it. So it's great that we're having this conversation saying that, yes, you can start to shine a light on these. I do a lot of what's called internal family systems work, where we're looking at these parts and saying, okay, I see you, and I'm going to give you a new job to do. And I'm curious, what do you do to help people once they start to see these patterns that you've mentioned, the 3 Ps, the people pleaser, the perfectionism, and the personalizing, and they become aware of it. How do you help people get unstuck and let go of them?
Yeah. So thanks for bringing that in, because it all, again, relates back to those tiny T's of where we had to give up our authenticity for our attachment to our families, for survival, for our peer group. And, our world will give us every single reason to become disconnected from who we truly are. And I think this is why midlife is, again, such a wonderful time to be able to really step into this.
Yeah, because we throw menopause on the fire, and then all of a sudden we don't have this estrogen that's helping to regulate the inflammation, and we start feeling, like, as you said, you started to feel physically ill. It wasn't just like not your mind or your emotions, but your body started speaking to you. So we experienced that. And then we were also experiencing maybe difficult relationships, divorce, empty nest, aging parents, looking at a career not being fulfilling, not having as much energy. So I think
All those
midlife is
things.
really that time where we're in that chrysalis and we start to wake up and say, my life's not working. What's going on here? How do I transform? So how do you help people to let go of these patterns and get unstuck so they can do this deep healing work and then start to become that butterfly?
Exactly. Yeah. Because I was in that cocoon. And let me tell you, you don't know always that you're in a cocoon when you're in it. It just feels like this mess. And it's like, when is that light going to come? And that's like really the journey that they're really, if you are in that place, you know, and on the outside, it's like, my life looks really good from the outside, but I'm not feeling it in my own body. I am not happy. You could be in, you know, we heard of the dark night of the soul. I actually call it the dark night of the womb because, and I'm not, you know, whether you have a womb or not, but it's like that incubator of where something new is perhaps having a chance to grow. And so noticing those times where we could call it the inner child, we could call it trauma. I've chosen a term called the damsel in distress. So it's like an old archetype, and it's an older or younger part of you that does feel helpless and does feel powerless and doesn't know where to kind of turn anymore. And that's
you're looking for the knight in shining armor.
Exactly.
But he or she doesn't exist.
And they're not coming. So again, like there can be some grief in that, you know, some sadness that maybe my relationships aren't really what I expected them to be. And that's okay. It's like coming into how things are now. So when you notice those patterns and, you know, the archetype of that damsel in distress, notice it, notice her. And really the job now is to look after her, to let her know, inner child, or, you know, whatever you want to call that part, to really look after her, which means letting her know that you're safe, you know, that right now you're okay. And I would say, first of all, spot it. The next thing would be to actually, if you can, it's not always possible, to name the emotions that you're feeling in your body.
Name it, you tame it. I said that all the time.
You name it, you tame it. Yes.
And you feel it, you heal it.
And you feel it, you have to feel it to heal it. You know, because we do jump to, I'll quickly do something, or I'll take action, or I'll change my thoughts. But there's also part of you, deeper in your body, that perhaps needs some attention, some care, some loving. So to feel it in your body, to feel, you know, that emotion. And, you know, the two tools that I really like to use, the first is starting to become embodied. So start to notice where you feel it in your body and hold it, know that it's okay, and ground yourself. So grounding in your feet and your seat will bring you back. So you'll notice I'm not really talking so much about thoughts, but more now about coming back to your body, finding some safety in your nervous system through your feet, your seat, and then that brings me to your breath.
And I would add too, for grounding, I think it's really powerful to walk barefoot on the earth, to do gardening. Swimming is great, bathing in Epsom salts, you know, just getting into the animal nature of your body. So yes, let's get into breath work, because what I love about breath work, and I do breath work myself, I do a lot of, you know, Kundalini breathing, all kinds of things, is that it's the quickest, safest, most cost-effective way to power down the parasympathetic. We've talked a lot about this fight, flight, freeze response, and get into, the sympathetic, the fight, flight, freeze response, and get into the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest, where you can actually heal. So yeah, tell me a little bit about it. I know you do this womb breath work. What is that? How did you get into breath work? Where can people start with breath work?
Yeah. It's that was a kind of this, you know, the other part of this journey was, you know, and I will say just about grounding too. I don't want to miss, if you don't feel that safe in your body yet, you will, but to actually have an object outside of yourself. So it might be something like, I have some rocks or nature or the sky to ground outside of yourself and eventually bring it in. So throughout this journey, I mean, I had been a trauma therapist for 30 years and, I love EMDR, and I had written a book on breathwork, breathing, about 10 years before. And I'd done so much trauma healing. And during this time, during COVID, I got COVID. And so I had to actually leave the house and we have a cabin. I went to our cabin by myself for 3 days, which was great in itself because I didn't feel that sick, actually. And what woman doesn't want a few days by herself? And so I happened to be on my computer, and I happened to join in a transformational breathwork journey. And I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll do this while I'm here. I've got the time. And I took this transformational breathwork journey, which was very different than the breathwork I'd taught before. So it wasn't so much the slowing down, relaxing, parasympathetic breathing. And I thought, oh, what's this? An hour and a half later, I was blown away. I literally finished that journey immediately. Within the next minute, signed up to get trained as a breathwork guide, and knew that this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, because it was instant. And I knew this was for me. And I started, as soon as I was trained, or even as I, in my practicum, started doing it with my clients, and they found the same thing that I did. And it was, we would come out the end and they would just say, I don't know what happened there, but I feel like I've healed more in that hour, or whatever it was, than I would have talking for 10 years. And I absolutely felt that in my own nervous system, in my own body.
Wow, I want to say that's super powerful on a couple levels. First, if you're listening and you're thinking, I get this from women all the time, is like, I have no idea what's next for me. You've got to follow the breadcrumbs of what you love and what you're interested in, and your intuition. Your intuition was like, yeah, I should do this thing. And that led you to this whole new line of work. And then I also love, I'm all for therapy. I'm a coach. I don't do therapy. I do coaching, which is a different animals, but sometimes we need the therapy. Sometimes we need to, look at trauma, but then also there are so many new modalities coming by. Like we're using a lot of psilocybin and ketamine and all of these kinds of substances in conjunction with therapy and breath work and all of these things. So, yes, if you're listening and I'm experiencing trauma, reach out to Madeleine, reach out and look at some of these other techniques, because I hear this all the time from people. I've been in therapy for years and I did this thing. And, within, 5-6 weeks, I made this huge leap transformation. So I love that you're sharing both how you found your midlife calling, your next chapter professionally, right, as well. And I'm curious too, to sort of round all of this out, how did doing this breathworking, this, how did it help to transform you? Because I know you were saying, like, I was in this place, it sounds like burnout and, stress and anxiety. How did your own personal transformation happen? Yeah. Where you are today?
That's really what kind of led me forward. And I should say, I was also, doing some work at a ketamine and a psychedelic therapy clinic at the time, and seeing these journeys happen. I thought, that's kind of what happens during breathwork. Only you're in charge.
Right. And you don't need to take those substances.
Yeah. Which I really, I believe in all of those ways. And there is a place for talking. I still do fair amount of psychotherapy as well. So it's like this now, the smorgasbord has just kind of opened a little bit. But what happened initially was I healed a part of my life. And I knew this intuitively in my body. In the first few days after the breathwork journey, it was a particular part of my life that I felt ashamed about. Like I felt like I should hide this part of me. It was during my teenage years where I really didn't know which way was up and which way was down. And I just knew from various new insights, awarenesses, thoughts I had, that part of me was here and was acknowledged and was loved. So that was like the first thing. I was like, that was my first awareness. the second thing I noticed that, almost immediately for me is I started just caring less, far less, and, not really much at all about what other people thought of me. And that showed up in my behavior. And so I was speaking more in situations, I was speaking up, I was showing up, and I really didn't really care, which is kind of interesting.
You quashed the people pleaser.
I must have, without having to even think about it. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And the third thing I noticed, and I'll talk about how I got to womb breathwork, is that I started immediately feeling more creative, feeling more intuitive, more willing to take risks, more willing to be messy. I took a painting class. I started writing more, like really writing from my heart, from my and putting it out there. And I don't really care what anybody says. Like, those were my first immediate things that I noticed. Of course, those fears rise again, and I can see them, they it comes and goes. But those were my first immediate things myself. And it changed everything because I just felt more connected with me, with my true authentic self, not this other part of me that I was presenting to the world.
Yeah, that is truly, truly beautiful. Amazing, amazing story. I am so grateful that you came on today. So if people want to reach out to you, so if people want to work with you, learn your womb breath work, where do they go?
I have a YouTube channel that I've really started showing up a lot on. It's Find Your Fire, Birth Your Inner Crone. And okay. I'm kind of reclaiming the word crone because meaning queen, or, the wise woman inside of you, your authentic true self. So my YouTube channel is a good place. My website is Mindful Living Now. And that's where I usually post a lot of my breathwork, my online breathwork journeys, as well as my courses.
And we'll put all of that in the show notes too. So if you're listening and you want to get in touch with Madeleine, it is all there. So thank you so much for sharing today. I really, really appreciate it. And just one last question. How are you rocking your midlife?
I'm taking a fair amount of time off, and how I got to that, particularly, this summer, how I got to that was getting very specific, as you can tell, about what I like to do, what I enjoy doing, and really doing that, rather than spreading myself too thin. And, for all your listeners, I feel like the more we can really hone in on what our real passions, inspirations, genius levels are, of where we, it could be like this big, to really follow that, as you said, follow those breadcrumbs. And that's allowed me to have more free time. And I took a windsurfing course last week.
Oh, good for you. I know I've got surfing Crazy. On my list of things to do. Well, thank you so much for joining. And thank you all for being here today. I hope that you have gained wisdom from Madeleine and what she has shared today. If you want to get in touch with me, just go to the midlifewhisperer.com. That's the midlifewhisperer.com. And if you're enjoying today's show, please leave me a review. It just helps other women find the show. Thank you again, Madeleine. Thank you all. And we'll catch you on the next episode of Rock Your Midlife. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Midlife can be challenging. You may be sandwiched between growing kids and aging parents, dealing with menopause or a health issue, and trying to find work-life balance. Or maybe your life looks good on the outside, but inside you're feeling stuck and wondering how to get your confidence, energy, and joy back. Hi, I'm Dr. Ellen, the Midlife Whisperer, and I hear you and I've got you. Think of me as the one-stop shop for all your midlife needs. I'm a psychologist, registered dietitian, nutritionist, board-certified health and wellness coach, and mindful self-compassion teacher. I'm also an author and podcast host with over 30 years of experience empowering midlife women. I provide inspiration and wisdom to help you transform your health, your mindset, your relationships, and your life so you can rock midlife.